Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is Tales of Suspense 47, cover dated November of 1963. This issue marks the first appearance of longtime Iron Man villain, the Melter, and was written by Stan Lee, drawn by Steve Ditko, inked by Don Heck, and lettered by Sam Rosen. Our issue opens up with a striking splash page, teasing Iron Man's coming battle with the wicked Melter. But before we can witness such an epic showdown, we must first travel to a testing range, where the army is demonstrating the maneuverability of its latest tanks, to a group of visiting congressmen. Yet despite being designed by genius inventor Tony Stark, the tanks fall apart only moments into the demonstration. Hearing of the incident, Stark heads to his main assembly plant in Long Island, New York, and begins inspecting a shipment of iron. But as expected, the iron is of the highest quality, and couldn't have been defective. So Stark pauses for a moment, and tries to think of another explanation. But as he's distracted by his own thoughts, he fails to notice as a mysterious costumed figure sneaks up, and strikes him from behind. Falling unconscious, Stark is helpless to stop as the villain activates a chest-mounted ray, and completely melts the shipment of iron. But who is this Melter, and why is he targeting Tony Stark? Well, his name is Bruno Horgan, and he was once one of Stark's chief competitors in the weapons business. But simply put, Horgan's weapons, and especially his tanks, were shoddy compared to Stark's, and thus his army contract was revoked in favor of Stark's designs. Swearing revenge on Stark, Horgan began experimenting with an iron melting beam that he had accidentally discovered. Refining and compacting it into a chest-mounted weapon, Horgan became the Melter, to get his revenge on Stark and the military for ruining his business. That takes us back to the present, as the Melters decided to spare Stark's life, since he'd rather continue toying with his former competitor, than be merciful and kill him. So with no reason to stay, he leaves Stark to plot his next move. Meanwhile, in the factory's executive offices, Stark's secretary Pepper has just asked Happy, Stark's chauffeur, to fetch their boss and get him to sign some reports. So Happy heads off to Stark's office, only to find him crawling on the floor outside. Helping him to his feet, Happy asks his boss what's happened. While Stark claims he'd merely tripped, in reality, the Melter's blow has weakened his heart, and he needs to recharge his chest plate immediately. So once he's back on his feet and in his office, he ushers Happy out, and plugs in the device that's keeping deadly shrapnel away from his heart. As he takes a moment to recharge, let's shift back to the Melter, who snuck his way into the factory's power plant, and is melting its main generator. But of course such flagrant destruction can't go unnoticed, as it triggers an alarm in Stark's office. Already recharged and ready to go, Stark immediately changes into Iron Man, and heads off to confront the Melter. When he arrives at the power plant, the Melter's surprised to see him, as he'd figured that Iron Man was just a rumor, meant to frighten away saboteurs. It's important to remember that in these early comics, everyone believed that Iron Man was just Stark's bodyguard. Regardless, the Melter then shifts his ray away from the generator, and right onto Iron Man. Just as he'd hoped, the beam melts straight through the hero's armor. But his aim was a little off, as he's only melted through the hero's left arm. Before we go any further though, it should be noted that the Melter's beam only affects iron, and is completely harmless to other materials, including living tissue. But this doesn't mean that Iron Man can afford to have his armor melted away, so without giving the Melter a chance to redirect his beam, he flies into the air, and then crashes through a wall in an attempt to escape. But all this motion strains his armor's batteries, forcing him to slow down. To shake the encroaching Melter off of his trail, he pulls out a pair of electromagnets, and throws them up at the ceiling. Pulling in opposite directions, the two magnets split open a nearby steam pipe, thereby engulfing the room in a cloud of searing gas. Satisfied with the damage he's already done, and not wanting to be burned by the scalding steam, the Melter finally flees the factory. With his exit, Iron Man quickly changes back into Tony Stark, and inspects his generators. While the Melter's damage is severe, it can thankfully be repaired. So Stark orders his maintenance crew to work around the clock for triple pay, and fix it as fast as they can. He then returns to his office, and demands that all of his appointments be cancelled, and that he be left completely undisturbed until further notice. Locking himself in his private workshop, Stark decides that he won't leave until he's come up with a way to defeat the Melter, no matter how long it takes. Finally emerging from his workshop the next morning, Stark's surprised to find that Pepper and Happy are still there. As it turns out, they'd stayed in their offices overnight, just in case they needed help. While nothing came up that whole time, Pepper's just picked up a call from a special congressional committee that's demanding to see Stark. Not eager to upset his biggest client, Stark quickly sneaks off, changes into Iron Man, and then flies to his cottage he owns on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. From there, he changes back into his normal clothes, hops into his futuristic sports car, and then whizzes to the Capitol building. Inside he's met by a group of furious congressmen, who demand to know why his tanks were faulty, and why he hasn't been meeting his production quotas. Stark tries to explain that it's the melter's sabotage, but the congressmen think the villain's a made-up excuse. So they give Stark an ultimatum. Either straighten out the trouble at his factory, or lose all of his government contracts. Before Stark can offer a response, a congressional aide interrupts the meeting, and informs him that there's been an emergency at his Long Island factory. While Stark immediately leaves for Long Island, he arrives too late. The melters already destroyed the factory, and the cleanup alone will take a week. So with nothing else to do, Stark changes into Iron Man, and begins helping with the cleanup. But unbeknownst to him, the melter's hiding in some bushes just outside the factory. Spotting Iron Man with a pair of binoculars, the melter decides it's finally time to finish him off. Melting his way back into the factory, the villain confronts Iron Man as he's holding a chunk of debris over his head, and as he's surrounded by Pepper and Happy. Wanting to toy with Iron Man, the melter first melts the debris that he's holding over his head, thus smothering him in melted iron. But thanks to tiny air jets within his armor, Iron Man's able to quickly dispose of the melted ore. Realizing that he won't be able to mess with Iron Man as he'd hoped, the melter turns to all reliable, and fires his melting beam right at the hero's chest. But to his shock and horror, the beam doesn't affect Iron Man in the slightest. Realizing that he's now powerless against Iron Man, the melter begins panically looking around for something to save him. Noticing a nearby crane, he aims his beam at an iron hook that's holding up a massive boulder, in the hopes that it'll fall on Iron Man. But in his state of panic, he's miscalculated, as the boulder's actually going to crush Pepper and Happy. Of course Iron Man rushes over and pushes the boulder out of the way, but in doing so, he gives the melter time to flee deep into the factory. Yet the factory's a sprawling complex that Stark knows like the back of his hand. Thus in only a few minutes he tracks down the melter, and remotely closes all of the factory's exits. With nowhere to go, the melter tries to melt the floor that Iron Man's standing on. But with his armor's built-in jets, Iron Man simply hovers over the hole in the floor. With this amazing feat, the melter finally accepts that Iron Man's truly unbeatable. So instead of trying to continue their fight, he simply melts a hole to the factory's underground sewer, and then jumps in. With his batteries nearly exhausted, by the time Iron Man reaches the hole, the melter's long gone. Not knowing if he escaped, or drowned, but without much time to dwell on it, Iron Man scurries off to change back to Tony Stark, and mend his damaged company. And thus the issue subsequently ends as Stark appears before his employees, with orders to get back to work. But as for how Iron Man was inexplicably impervious to the melter's beam, well, it turns out that Stark had actually been wearing a suit made entirely of tough extruded aluminum, for as noted before, the melter's ray only worked on iron. That concludes Tales of Suspense 47, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a solid, simple story. It didn't swing for the fences, but still worked as a straightforward and entertaining Iron Man adventure. My only real complaint is that the melter destroying Iron Man's factory is a pretty blatant rehash of last issue, in which the Crimson Dynamo destroyed a bunch of Stark's munitions plants, and the government threatened to revoke his contracts because of it. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.